In the next video lecture, we'll talk to some Emory Law students who are taking a course in immigration law. This semester they have studied the constitutional doctrines that we have discussed briefly here. You may or may not agree with their opinions, but I hope that these will serve as a basis for discussion on the forum, a discussion which I look forward to reading.
Well, something that was surprising to me, I think it's really easy to assume that people who are in this country are protected by the U.S. Constitution, and something that surprised me about the plenary power that Congress has is that so many non-citizens don't get the same constitutional rights and protections that we all get as U.S. citizens.
Right. And I think that, we teach our, high school students in their civics courses about checks and balances and how, that whole idea kind of goes out the window with the plenary power. And, there is no judicial, oversight of what Congress does with respect to immigrants. And so it's this whole section of the law that is kind of the exception to the rule with our, Constitution.
And especially the lack of oversight when it comes to powers given to agencies, so that the way that, someone that's caught within 100 miles of the border and can't provide the proper documentation immediately can just, on the discretion of a border agent, just be yanked out of the country without any other recourse.
And then with deprecation proceedings, it's kind of like a criminal trial a little bit, because the government is affecting your liberty rights and taking things away from you in a similar kind of way, but you don't have the same kind of constitutional protections like the right to have an attorney. So you might be an immigrant who speaks very little English and isn't even entirely sure what's going on at the time, and you don't have the same kind of constitutional protection that we give to a citizen in a similar situation.
Mm-hmm. Or the paper, I think it was your paper today, the first offender. You can plead guilty to a small, either possession or even smaller than that, and not realize that you can be deported for that, or, lose your rights just on something that small. And not only that can happen, but that can happen without you actually knowing it. Mm-hmm. And that lack of information not be sufficient to get a new trial or to change your plea.
Yeah.
I think it's also interesting that there's not much of a distinction between undocumented immigrants and, the legal immigrants.
Right.
They still, even the ones who we give visas to, who we, consider, permanent residents, they are still not afforded full constitutional protection. And I think that that's something that, is a really big problem and hopefully is addressed in reform.
Mm-hmm. Mm. I thought it was interesting, the differences and the rights that were afforded, whether or not you were actually able to stand on American soil and try and assert those rights, versus when you leave the country, and whether it be kind of appealing a decision that led to deportation, or something as simple as trying to change your status to get permanent residency. How we were talking about, you might be required to leave the country. Mm-hmm. And then just leaving, you can actually be barred. I mean, doing every step right,
so difficult
you can be barred.
To get back in when you're trying to do the right thing.
Yeah, and then once you're barred, you just kind of...
Mm-hmm. Right, and I think that, kind of speaks to kind of moving into immigration reform, just the lack of effectiveness of the immigration system as a whole, trying to get any sort of visa, it's just a nightmare, and, for employers and immigrants alike. So I think that, these problems are much larger than just, undocumented aliens being in our country. It's a systematic problem.
And then the whole problem with the way that it's set up, actually encouraging immigrants to do what is probably not the right thing to do, or what they might be more, like, in their own conscience, be morally inclined to do, because they know that, if they come forward with oh, by the way, I did overstay my visa, so in that kind of situation, well, isn't it easier to just not say anything,
right,
than risk being barred from the United States for the next 10 years?
It discourages legal activity.
Right. Yeah.
Just in general, I had no basis in immigration, so it has been, I knew it was complicated, but it has been extraordinarily complicated trying to wrap my mind around the difference. Okay, you're this is your status. What does that mean? Who's in charge of what? I mean, the whole system is just so. I mean, it's just like any other branch of the government, but it's just awful. And like, especially since the original aim of immigration was to, kind of monitor the comings and goings, and then, since 1996, but especially post September 11th, it's really changed to national security. There's no real clear aim of what the system's even trying to do and who it's trying to let in and who it's trying to keep out, and especially with DHS kind of taking over so many functions and that being just a conglomerate of over 130 different agencies. I mean, it is out of control as to who is doing what and who knows what and who can access whose information
And why.
Yeah, and think about, as a law student, how hard that is to wrap your head around. And if you're coming to this country for the first time, maybe not fluent in English, maybe have a middle school education and not a lot of resources, and I
don't have 100 hours to burn doing legal research.
Right, exactly. Or, not even knowing who to talk to about it, or having the right to an attorney to help you through this process. I can't imagine how hard that would be and how confusing that would be.
Well, I think, like you were saying, though, I think that comes from there being several different intents behind all these different acts that make up what is our immigration system right now. And, and our immigration intent and, goals were different, in the 60s as they were in the 80s, as they were in the 90s, as they were post September 11th. So, we have a lot of different goals that create kind of a I don't know, I'm not sure what I'm trying to say.
Disconnected.
Yeah, exactly. We have several different goals, coming together that make this very disconnected immigration system, and the rules don't match one another.
Mm-hmm. And I think that because there's no clear, not aim, there are clear objectives, but there's no clear route by which to reach that objective, that each agency or each different laws, it's not passed as being part of a whole, or it's not created as being part of a whole. It's created to address a certain issue, and then when you try, they don't fit together in any way. And so, okay, right now we're going to focus on this objective, and we're not going to really enforce every aspect of this law. And I think that happens often. And so, it basically gets down to a cost-benefit analysis in terms of whether or not you're going to abide by a law. And when there's no clear objective and laws aren't, enforced across the board, like you said, it just becomes better. You can leave the country and overstay your visa and have a pretty good chance of getting back in. Or, you can stay here and, work under the table and have a pretty good chance of not getting caught. When there's no coherent enforcement of the laws, they just lose their effectiveness. And then more laws are passed to try and plug the holes, and then it just gets to be unworkable.
It reminds me of that one example of that crime boss that we read about from the 60s, where they tried to deport him for 20 years, and then they finally deport him to some random, I forget the country. It was a random country in South America. It was like Chile or something. And he just came right back. Like within a couple days, he just hopped on a plane and came back in through Florida, and that was it. So clearly, there's definitely at least a situation of the right half of the brain not always talking to the left half of the brain.
And so much of that depends on who you are. And I think it's been interesting to see kind of the thread of race-based policy and legislation and court decisions too, throughout the 20th century into the 21st century. Starting from the Chinese Exclusion Acts, racial quotas, up to post-September 11th, focus on Muslims and Arabs and specific groups, and treating them very differently than maybe Western Europeans trying to enter the United States.
Yeah, there's no question that the limitations on certain countries' entrance, our immigration system started and still is very discriminatory. Those problems are clear even on our borders. We are not building a fence on the Canadian border.
Right.
And so I think that, the discriminatory practices in our immigration system are really sad. And I think it kind of goes back to having very little judicial review. No one challenges it on equal protection or anything else like that. It's always just, again, an exception to many of our American standards.
The preceding program is copyrighted by Emory University.